Section 7 of On Being Negro in America by J. Saunders Redding. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The assumptions that were held valid in my childhood were all wrong. So much has been said about them that I mention them reluctantly, but their strength is attested by the fact that many, many still trust them, and not merely Southern whites and the misinformed and the ignorant, nor whites alone, but blacks. Harding Carter, novelist and Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, no doubt deserves his reputation as a Southern liberal, but only a few months ago he wrote of a common insistence upon white political domination in the South, which is as unbreakable as anything woven by the mind of man, and declared himself unalterably committed to race segregation on the ground of preserving the whites' race ethnic integrity. Somewhat earlier, the Georgia Commissioner of Agriculture had said, the yellow people, the brown people, and the blacks, not even bothering to add people, are mentally unfit for directors in our form of government. And in 1951, Kerr Scott, the governor of North Carolina, most liberal state in the South, echoed the Georgian. Asked by a Negro reporter why his inaugural promise had been fulfilled only to the extent of making one Negro appointment, the governor snapped, "If I were you, I'd never have asked that question. I have given you people more than you can handle. That's why I tell you you should never have asked that question." So the old assumptions hold. The assumption of the Negro's inherent inferiority, of tragic social and cultural consequences if segregation is broken down on anything but the most superficial levels, the Negroes preferring segregation, and many more. They were taken on in the first place as rationalizations by means of which the white man tried, as Gunnar Myrdal says, to build a bridge of reason between his acclaimed egalitarian creed and his countervailing deed. Because of this guilt-ridden adoption, they were the more avidly loved. They are also the more furiously drummed into the general consciousness where, reverberating like thunder in a valley, they have rolled out the tune to which white people and Negroes have danced since 1900. The Negroes because they must. It is a static but a curiously hectic dance. We gyrate through its complicated patterns with responses as conditioned and involuntary as reflexes. In spite of all the fervent clapping and shouting, our reactions to the race problem are not really emotional and intellectual, but muscular. I cannot now, as long ago I could, believe in the moral and intellectual conviction of the demagogues, of men like Richard Russell and James Burns and Strom Thurmond, for I cannot believe that the findings of modern science are so cabined and confined, even in South Carolina, Georgia, and Mississippi, as to escape the knowledge of these educated men. The older demagogues had this to excuse them. They were ignorant. The younger ones are knowing puppeteers, cynically manipulating the strings of the past. And even the masses who respond to the strings know better than they used to. Even with them, conviction flags and cynicism takes over. The moral conviction that it was for the social welfare that they reserved all power to themselves no longer operates. Power for power's sake is now the rule. And when a leading Georgia politician said so in a political address, the rafters rang. We have the power, and we mean to keep it where it belongs. If the Negroes vote wholesale, and if the county unit system goes, we'll have that much less power, but it must not go. The county unit system, which used to protect our rural population from slick city politics, now arms us all with power against the enemies of white supremacy. The old assumptions hold, but worse, others have been added to evade the knowledge that cannot now be ignored, and to make possible the conformity to the vicious dialectic of power, which rings as plangently in America now as in the rest of the world. And the chief of them is this, that hostility is the accepted state in which to live. Dualism is looked on as the natural division of absolute opposites, of enemies, communism and democracy, Eastern man and Western man, native and foreign. And most pertinent to this argument, black and white. Not black as formerly, the pathetically weak and erring child of nature, nor white as formerly, the tolerant chastiser and protector, the strong adult, but black raised by the findings of science, and the decisions of the highest court in the land to close equality with white, and therefore the enemy to white. Exaggerated? But toward truth, not away from it. That competition which was once confined to the lowest economic levels, and which resulted in the legendary hatred of the poor white masses for the Negro, and vice versa, operates on higher levels now. It is on the level of skilled labor, as the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Firemen knew when they brought suit to enjoin railroads from promoting Negro firemen, also members of the Brotherhood, to engineers. It is on the level of education, and persons reporting to be students of a medical college of the University of South Carolina admitted sending threatening letters to a Negro applicant and burning a cross on his front lawn. It is on the level of the professions, so that a committee of the National Bar Association, a Negro group, felt constrained to report that as the quality of training rises, Negro lawyers find it harder to win admission to the bar in some Southern states. Actually, of course, it is no longer possible to predicate discrimination and segregation on Negro inferiority. So long as it was possible, and seemed forever possible, the practical-minded found a kind of social justification in disenfranchisement, in raising economic and cultural barriers, in the despotic paternalism which said, "Thou shalt not." Even the Negro leader, Booker Washington, found it blameless and indeed good, without ever suspecting that the tradition of noblesse oblige, on which all this was claimed to be founded, might some day be as ineffective as necromancy. Segregation was order, it was control, it was the steel and concrete casing sealing up a devastating social explosion. It still seems so to the vast majority and their leaders. The strongest voices in the South today say that segregation must be kept. Governor James Burns, in his inaugural, was not so intent on expressing his views on foreign policy that he did not assure his listeners of his unaltered opposition to the fair deal. Harding Carter, the liberal mentioned above, is not so liberal that he does not see it as tragic for the South, the Negro, and the nation itself, if segregation is done away with. And only a fool, Lillian Smith quotes from the Atlanta Constitution, would say the Southern pattern of separation of the races can or should be overthrown. But if segregation must be kept, it must now be predicated on something else than Negro inferiority. And what else is there? The cynical ideology of power worship, what H.A. Overstreet calls the fight and grab image, the philosophy of hate. It is what Hitler came to. It is the result of a pattern of thinking desperately threatened by science and social change. End of Section 7. Section 8 of On Being Negro in America by J. Saunders Redding. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 8. I am an integrationist. I have been for a long time. It is not a principle that I arrived at through intellection. Until the past few years, I did not bring to bear on it whatever intelligence I have. I felt my way to it, just as some men, in spite of obstructing experience, feel their way to ideals of honesty, sobriety, and continence. Nor was the feeling of my way wholly conscious. It was rather like the action of one who kicks and splashes frantically to save himself from drowning, and suddenly finds that he has reached a shelf on which he can stand in the river bed. His objective was not the shelf, but just to be saved. I kicked and splashed in all directions, and suddenly there I was. I was an integrationist when the communists camped almost nightly on my trail in the early 1930s, and lighted beckoning bright fires in the frightening dark of that time. I did not believe then, any more than now, that the moment the bars of segregation are lifted, all the white women of the South will fall into the arms of Negro mates. Many of my acquaintances gleefully profess to believe this, would just as gleefully declare that Negroes lynched for rape had been only unlucky in being caught with their always willing white paramours. They found substance for this opinion in both fact and fiction, which too loudly proclaimed the revulsive feeling of the white female for the Negro, and the inviolable purity of white womanhood. My acquaintances believed that Southern whites protested too much. And so, it seems, did the Communists, or perhaps they did not. It could have been just a line in the carrying out of explicit directives on how to recruit Negroes in the Eastern States. It could have been that they were played expertly on what they thought were the secret dreams of a young, green, mixed-up, and lonely man. I suppose all people suffer from these maladies, and especially from youth and early adulthood, and I had more besides. I had a severe case of negrophobia, which alternately wrenched my heart with hate and love. I was confused about the direction of my life, and extremely doubtful, as I sometimes am today, of life's purpose. Whether naturally or through learning, I shrank from all but a handful of people, and some of these were a disappointment to me, and I have no doubt that I was a sore trial to them. I lacked social accommodation. I've never thought tolerance admirable as a principle either of adjustment or feeling, and I rejected it entirely for my friends. Dogs were to be tolerated, and crying babies, and strangers with whom one did not have to become acquainted. My friends were constantly not living up to my foolish expectations. My judgments were severe. I was continually breaking with them and rejoining them, but with no increase in understanding. I do not think I would have become a communist even had these deficiencies not been in me. But certainly, except for them, the communists would have had an easier time assailing my weak position on the extreme left flank of democracy. The wrong scouts came to reconnoiter, and they took the wrong approach. The first who came was a moist, sleazy fellow, fat and asthmatic. I had often seen him in the little restaurant where I took dinner. Frequently he would be there in low-voiced conversation with various people, men and women, when I entered. He always sat at the round family table back in the corner at an angle from the door, and my glance would fall there first. There would be beer before him, and it was just legal again, and a dish of olives and olive pits and a plate of fried potatoes which he ate with his fingers. Though I did not think he was aware of me, no one could be unaware of him. Even from my table by the window, with my back squarely toward him, I was conscious of his presence. In lulls of dish rattling and conversation, his wheeze could be heard all over the tiny restaurant. One evening, when I came there later than usual, because I had waited for a cold rain to stop, and took my place, Eric, the German waiter, told me that Philip wanted to talk to me. He indicated the fat man at the big table. There was little possibility of Eric's having made a mistake. The restaurant had only a dozen tables, and it catered to a limited and steady patronage of unimportant executives, clerks, and apprentices from the jewelry manufactories, and a few plebeian graduate students like myself. I do not remember ever seeing another Negro there. Even though Eric had made no mistake, I was sure that I did not want to talk to Philip. But before I could put my thoughts into words and summon the courage to utter them, Philip was standing there. He looked at me expressionlessly as he pulled the chair far out to allow for his pendulous belly and sat down. "This rain. My friends are all late tonight," he said. "You'll excuse me." There was nothing questioning or tentative or apologetic in the way he spoke. I was acutely embarrassed. He took a piece of potato out of the dish he had brought with him and carried it to his mouth. It was a small, full-lipped mouth. His hands, too, I noticed, were small and very white, though the nails and the knuckles were dirty, in contrast to his moist, flushed face. "What does the J in your name represent?" he asked. I was taken by surprise. It must have shown it, for he blew out an indulgent laugh. "You wouldn't think I would know your name." This was not a question either. "I do," and he spoke it. The sound of it, coming from a complete stranger, seemed to establish some kind of power over me. I felt a twinge of fright even, as if I were suddenly vulnerable in ways I knew not of. "How do you know?" He swung his head from side to side, and his face smiled at me. "I know, and I know more," he said. He called off items of biographical fact as if he were reading from a file card: the year and place of my birth, my father's name, my brother's name, my schooling, an attack of scarlet fever I had had. Momentarily I half expected him to go into an account of monstrous crimes I had committed in some other and unremembered character. It seems silly now, for I know that to get such information as he had was an easy matter, but then I felt that for some dark purpose I could not guess 1,000,000 pairs of eyes had followed me since birth. I do not wish to play up this episode, nor to dramatize my reaction to it, for what followed was ridiculous emotional anticlimax. Through the next talk Philip had with me a week or so later, his efforts to get on terms of easy familiarity dissipated my sense of being mysteriously overpowered and exposed. I did not respond to the first name camaraderie. Not knowing his last name, I avoided calling him anything. I think my formal civility frustrated him, and I think this is why, in a kind of desperation during the third or fourth meeting, he pulled out a folder of very detailed, obscene photographs and handed them to me. He laughed when he asked in pretended casualness, for I could feel him watching me sharply, whether I had seen anything like them before, and weren't they the most amusing things, and one in particular, because he knew the girl in it, a student at the art school. He had some delicious friends, he said, and he would like me to meet them. He said that there was one bonny brunette especially from way down in Georgia, but completely, and I mean completely, emancipated, and without prejudice. They lined up fast enough once they were really free, he said, and it only went to show what would happen to the race problem all over the country were it not for the strength and pressure of reaction. There just wouldn't be any of it if it were left to the women. I think Philip was running way ahead of his timetable, or, to change the figure, he had cast his net on the wrong side. There was not enough weight to it, in any case. I knew later that there was quite a potential catch of assorted fish, including a young college student who wore very thick glasses, a French-descended politician who had considerable power in local labor circles, and a very wealthy widow in her late 30s. Even then the widow was contributing generously to the cell, and some years later she became nationally known as pro-communist. There were others too, but I do not know how they had been approached, nor how many were caught. Perhaps Philip and those who joined him in subsequent weeks fumbled the assignment badly. At least this one got away. The approach to my intellect is not through my gonads. One approach, perhaps, is through my curiosity, and it was curiosity that teased me into going here and there with Philip. I wanted to see what kind of people these were. I had listened to soapbox communists on the streets of New York, but they had aroused nothing in me save vague speculations over such questions as were bruited about in those days. What was wrong with our government? Did the rich and powerful think only to gain more power and reap more benefits from the exploitation of the working class? What should the government do? What could it do? What was Hoover doing that he should not do, and vice versa? I felt a certain shallow contempt for the emotionalism, the unreasoning bitterness, and the actless anger of the soapbox radicals. I do not know whether it was because they were a cohesive motley of white Americans, Negroes, Italians, Portuguese, and French, but I liked better the brazen self-interest of the radical workers whom I had seen milling about the shut-down, what an ominous word that was, blank-walled factories in southwest Providence. But I could not identify with them either. They talked of violence, and did violence, as once when the police tried to scatter them, in an implacable, matter-of-fact way that repelled me. I've never believed in violence. I have heard Negroes advocate it. I once knew of a group of Negroes who organized to kill a white man every time a Negro was lynched. They called themselves the Quick Cure Club, Incorporated. In grim parody of the Ku Klux Klan, they were to have branches in every principal city of the South, though it was rumored, and is still widely believed among Negroes, that the violent and unsolved murder of a constable in Greene County, Missouri, in the 1930s, was the work of the Black KKK. I think the organization never really got started, nor could I identify myself in more than a superficial way with the campus group of intellectual radicals with whom a common interest in writing brought me into contact. They were enthusiastic and well-meaning, but quite innocent and harmless. They knew considerably more about John Reed, Haywood Brown, and H. L. Mencken than about Marx, Lenin, and the and the deviationism of Trotsky. They knew something about Nietzsche, too, and they were learning. Googled something about Freud, but the German philosopher's will to power was not translated into political terms, and Freud's civilization and its discontents, which had only recently appeared in this country, was simply a yardstick by which they measured their imaginary personal gripes against smugness and conservatism. Theirs was the rebellion of youth. They talked a lot. What they said was mostly brilliant nonsense, which had no more relation to the actual destruction of the bridges over which their parents had passed than a pyrotechnic display on a moonless night. Only one of them became a writer, a humorist, and a good one. His latest book now lies before me. Sensitive, talented, some of them wealthy, they turned out to be thoroughly conservative college professors, investment brokers, and lawyers who had no trouble making a peace with things as they are. My problems were different from theirs. The drive, self-preservation, anxiety, vanity, sex, the complete discharge of strength Nietzsche speaks of, were considerably modified by my Negro-ness. Such an admission is embarrassing to make, but I recognized its truth even then. Self-preservation, for example, was not a galvanic drive in me, nor in other Negroes I knew. I have written elsewhere that 5 of my closest acquaintances committed suicide in the span of 6 red and terrible years. Pride and vanity were excessive. Since Negroes were assumed to be sexually immoderate, I made a show of strict asceticism, chastising the flesh in a way most unnatural to youth. What I did not recognize was that I was being forced into the narrowest egocentrism, into an involvement with self that was morbid beyond reason, and that only the lucky are able to sublimate. And this only partially, into group concern, and with extreme luck, wider social concern. It needed not be said, and certainly not in the way of apology, that this is not altogether the fault of the Negro. It is the fault also of the American life situation, neither quite an accidental wickedness, nor a complex of impersonal coercions, over which both the individual and the group control of minority people is limited. The campus group of intellectual radicals broadened me. They stimulated my reading, my imagination, my sympathies, to the reading of James, Santayana, and De Unamuno, to whom Professor Ducasse had introduced me. I added Nietzsche, especially Thus Spake Zarathustra, and Marx, and much else that I would not have come across in the ordinary routine of my graduate study. But I was not broadened enough to take what Philip and his circle offered. Had their first offering stayed on the level of the first parties I attended with Philip, matters might have been different. I could take any amount of talk, and there ran through their rapid-fire conversations phrases that, exploding like firecrackers, drew my attention. The political state, as distinct from the economic and social state, they were drawing such distinctions then. The omnicompetent state, responsibility in areas of cultural autonomy. Of course I had ideas as to meanings, but nothing they said really coalesced into concepts. I was not moved either to agreement or disagreement. I simply heard. In later meetings, however, I began to listen and to understand, but not what it was expected I would understand, rather the opposite. I began to comprehend that they talked like people who had a vested interest in a democratic catastrophe. It was not communism's strength and validity, its constructive and health-seeking activities on which they based their argument. It was on democracy's weaknesses. They rejoiced in the economic depression because they saw in it the beginning of democracy's total collapse. The ideal, they said, was security and freedom, and I agreed with this. But under your system, they were talking directly to me and to Hakeley, a young but grizzled silversmith apprentice, there is neither. They were too smart, actually, to make capitalism and democracy synonymous, so I could judge only that this equating one with the other was a deliberate effort to confuse. And I was confused, and I showed it in childish exasperation at the way in which they pointed out, with a kind of glib, cold fervor, every weakness, every failure, every instance of corruption and discrimination and injustice, and how these affected one personally, and especially the Negro. The inference was plain that in the omnicompetent state, the service state, which were equated, these things would not be. But when I pressed for proof of their inferences, Philip and the intellectual leaders of the cell withdrew into taunts and challenges, and were not percipient enough to see how dangerously they threatened my self-esteem. The idea of democracy was itself not particularly dear to me then, but I resented the doubts cast on my inherited assumptions about it. If anything, I resented democracy for leaving me and itself so defenseless. But I hated communism for putting me on the defensive. My anger and frustration carried over from one meeting to the next, for though their arguments were basically weak, I had no answers to them. After the 5th meeting, I was certain that I was through with the communists and all their works. But I did not figure on the proselyting passion of Philip and Honey. This latter was one of the 5 women in the cell whom I had seen regularly at meetings. Honey was a cell nickname, and it suited only her physical appearance. Among her colleagues at the city hospital, where she told me she worked as a technician, she was known as Branka. I never learned her last name. Of foreign extraction, Austrian or Czech, I judged. She had soft honey-blonde hair, worn in a long bob, so that when she turned or lowered her head, a wave of hair fell across her face. It was a good face, not pretty and decorated, but well-structured and strong, with pale yellow eyes set under square brows. She talked a great deal in a rather strident and insolent tone, and she laughed a lot, insolently, too. Both her laughter and her talk seemed to come from very near the surface, yet one felt that she had depths. Sometimes one was as hard put to follow the erratic train of her thought as to follow her restless, vital movements. Philip and Honey came to my lodging-house one night, after I had twice failed to show up at meetings. It was embarrassing to have them come there, for my landlady, though she had been born and had lived all her life in New England, and though she thought that this was in itself some sort of victory or credit for a Negro, my landlady was only less suspicious of white people than she was of Negroes who consorted with them. Even had they desired it, my visitors could not have come in, so I went with them to the 2 untidy rooms which Honey occupied over a delicatessen in the oldest and a step from genteel section of the city. There were just the 3 of us, and over a bottle of very sour wine, which was called Dago Red, they questioned me about my absences. I told them that I had been preparing for mid-year examinations, which was true, and anyway was I to consider myself obligated to be present at every cell meeting. They looked at each other for a moment. Then Honey laughed deliciously and said, "Of course not," and Philip laboriously wheezed an echo of this. In cell meetings Philip was the center, but here Honey had complete charge. She led the talk into all sorts of trivial channels, shifting restlessly in her chair, tossing her head, crossing and uncrossing her legs. Honey talked and talked. Her vitality and the wine were exhilarating. She was profane and final in her judgments of people. She jokingly accused Philip of trying to bring into the cell some profound asses, some absolutely untouchable unteachables, like a certain Sidney she mentioned, who was positively, she said, a reconditioned pervert. Oh, she was sure of it. And Fay Harriston, this was the wealthy widow, who every day jumped into a barrel of peroxide, and who, for all her efforts at femininity, showed that she was a conditioned hermaphrodite. Laughing gaily, Honey wanted to know what Philip was doing, recruiting people for his own pleasure? Was that what he was making of the cell, a circle of lesbians and libertines? Unembarrassed and unsmiling, Philip only shook his head, and after a time Honey went on to something else. The atmosphere was very casual, very friendly, and I was sorry when Philip announced that he must leave. It was my cue to go too, and I got up. There was a moment's hesitation before Philip said, "Oh, but I'll be back. You wait for me here." I looked at Honey, but she was already reclaiming the hat I had picked up. I thought she smiled mockingly at Philip. What Honey and I talked about after Philip's departure I do not know. In my notebook the next day I wrote exactly what follows. I wish I could make out a case of moral rectitude for myself, but I cannot. What I kept thinking of last night was all the possible consequences. When Honey came and sat on the couch too close to me, I remembered all I had heard about parlor whores, that they were bold and brazen and without discrimination, and that they were bound to be diseased. I'd never had more than a dozen words with her until last night, so there was no affection for me. There was only passion, and even this may not have been genuine. I half wished it were, or that I could think it so. My feeling was that her object was to arouse passion in me while she kept herself out of it and under control. She shivered and rolled her head against my shoulder and dug her nails into my thigh, but I think that it was all faked. I do not know what we talked about between times, or whether we talked about anything. But if she were outside it, I was outside it too, and I kept thinking that Honey had some ulterior motive, and that she was trying to realize it at too high a price. I knew that she wanted me to have sex relations with her, and I knew also that I would not, could not, dared not. I do not think she tempted me at all, really. She just frightened me. I did not see how anyone could go to such a length to obtain a result that in the long run could have almost no importance. Certainly I cannot think myself that important to the Communists. And suppose this were not her reason, then what? Just sex? I cannot trust a white woman that way, no matter how willingly a white woman gives herself to a colored man. If she is found out, she will yell rape. Last night I pictured newspaper headlines such as I have seen many times, and I thought of them referring to me, black brute. I did the right thing last night, though maybe I did it for all the wrong reasons. I fled. Though I knew I had done the right thing, I was ashamed to see Honey and Philip again, for I convinced myself that I had been naif and cowardly. I did not go back to the little restaurant at the bottom of the hill. Once I had a note from Philip, and once he, or someone very like him, inquired of me from my landlady, but I did not see him, nor Honey, nor any of the people I used to see in the cell. I am certain that Honey, laughing with strident insolence, spoke of me as one of Philip's untouchable unteachables, and pretty quickly forgot me. End of section 8.